Now bear with me, this is something kind of different for me and different for the channel, and it's going to be looking at this. This, of course, is the Transformers SHattered Glass 5-part series from IDW Comics. Now everybody knows that I've tried on numerous occasions to get into these comics, and I've never been able to do it. I've never thought that they're particularly well done. And I tried to jump in many, many times over the years. And sometimes people say, like, such and such is an amazing story. And I'm like, as a teacher, as an author, as a writer, no, they're not. They're not. And if you like it, cool. It's just, I guess I'm overly critical, I suppose. I can't look at it as a passing fan. I have to look at it and nitpick because it's just what's in my nature. You know, like the old story about the fox and the scorpion. Or sometimes it's a frog and a scorpion. And the scorpion still stings when they're going across the river because it's in his nature, right? Well, my nature is to be critical of things that I read. But because I was in for the Shattered Glass lads, I do have the entire set. You may notice as we go through that the third one is actually the stock release because I found Starscream in store. It wasn't the Pulse one, but all the other ones are the Pulse exclusive iterations of these comics. Not that there's much difference, to be fair. The story is the story. We're going to see how it goes. I'm willing to give it a chance. We'll see how it goes. They're going to have to really kind of impress me. I know that they've lost the license and that it's going elsewhere, and I think that that's probably a welcome change. But for one of the last hurrahs, I'm willing to give it a chance and see how this is. Before anybody says anything, man, I'm going to say this right now. People will always point out sins of the record, say it's amazing. It was passable. I read it, it was a passable story. Dark Cybertron, nice idea. Again, the way it was written, I thought it could have been written better. It was passable. It was all right. Those two, I would say, are the high points of what I've read. And I'm not blown away by either. So this is going to be an uphill climb, but I'm willing to give it a chance. We'll see how it goes in the latest GotBot True. Hey one, hey all, welcome back to the channel. I'm your host, your most humble of hosts, Dennis Moulton, aka GotBot. As always, man, please like, comment, share, of course, subscribe while you're at line, my baby. And hit that notification bell, please. It helps me out a ton. It lets you know when content of all sorts goes up here on the channel. Check out Machinery of Man, The Everything Factor, all of the groups that I'm either a mod or an admin for, as well as all of my social media links. All of that in the description down below. Also in the description down below. And if you're in a position to help the channel to grow, you can use the donate link. You can check us out on Patreon. You can see what we have to offer you through Teespring. Or, of course, you can hit the join button right here on YouTube and become a channel member. And like I said, this is the Shattered Glass series. I have not been a fan of the treatment of Transformers by IDW. It's just, it hasn't been my thing. Bless you if it is your thing. It's just, it hasn't resonated with me. Never really did. But I love Shattered Glass as a concept. So I was really excited to see what we would come up with. And I feel like since this is the only complete story that I own, that's not on loan or anything, that I own from this company for this series, I was like, you know what? This is my chance now to kind of see if there's some redeeming qualities here, things that I can enjoy here. We'll see how it goes. I will say this. I do like the blur cover. I like the way he's running. I like the electricity and whatnot behind him. But I would be careful of overusing this style because it also feels very anime. Like there's something with the kind of background being just like a color with lines on it that feels very Unicron Trilogy-ish to me, and I didn't like that. But I think it works for Blur. Then we get to Megatron. And I get it, it's glass shattering and energy coming out. While I like the look of the Megatron, all right, I feel like the way the coloring was done was weird, and I don't like the background being so vague. I wish the background had a cityscape or something, a battlescape or something. I'm not a huge fan of the way the background was done here. I do love the colors though. Then we have the like off-the-shelf version of issue 3. I like this. Starscream getting all ready for his battle and stuff, and you know he's surrounded by a lot of Autobots and whatnot. I think that that's a neat cover. I like it. Then we have the Goldbug one. Again, the background is what it is. Goldbug looks all right. I mean, it's definitely a stylized Goldbug from what he's supposed to look, but it looks all right. I'm not hateful against it. And then the very last one, this one I do like. I like that it looks like he's flying out of the glass specifically, not jumping out of it or anything like that. It's like he just smashed through this, man. I feel like just like the cover matched for Blur in the beginning, I feel like this style can also match for Shattered Glass Jetfire. So I'm okay with it for the first issue and the last issue. In terms of how we're going to treat this, I'm going to do this in 5 chapters. I'll talk about my takeaway from each of the comics, and then we'll do kind of an overall feel of what I thought this turned out like. Good, bad, or ugly. So without any further ado, how about we head over, not really to the table this time, you'll see how this goes, and take a closer look at this story. And here we go with the good, the bad, and or the ugly. We'll see how this goes. Like I said, I will note now that there will definitely be spoilers throughout this overview, because there needs to be in order to do a proper discussion about this. If you want to avoid the spoilers and you kind of just want my overall impressions, you can go closer toward the end of this video where I'm back on camera to do the outro, and I'll try and keep that section pretty spoiler free, but it will also be pretty vague. Let's begin with a little bit of background history, certain things that I, as a fan of Shattered Glass, expect to see, want to see, would like to see here. I've always been a fan of Shattered Glass or mirror universes, right back in its kind of early beginnings with Star Trek, the original series, and on through. We've seen it with different comic book iterations, and of course Shattered Glass is the Transformers iteration of that. Really, this concept began at BotCon 2008. It was mostly based on G1, but not exclusively. We've certainly had other molds that were not G1 used for certain characters. The Shattered Glass Bumblebee, or I guess Goldbug, so to speak, was, for example, Cybertron Hotshot. The IDW Shattered Glass Bumblebee is the Bumblebee body, not the Cliffjumper body. It's important to note because his color scheme as Bumblebee was very Bug-Bite-like. However, that being said, it's not Bug-Bite. Bug-Bite has the Cliffjumper body. Shattered Glass Bumblebee has the Bumblebee body. I expect Optimus Prime to be insane, basically. I mean, the guy is known for talking to corpses. So, there's a dark side to Optimus Prime. I expect him to be maniacal here. He doesn't care about his underlings, so I also expect him to be very kind of cold and cruel as well. Unicron, I believe Unicron rebuilt him as Nova Prime, and Nova Prime becomes, a messenger of justice, and goes back and defeats Rodimus Prime, who had taken power in his absence, as the original story goes. So I kind of expect a certain redemption for Optimus Prime, where he becomes Nova Prime, who is actually a good guy, because remember, this is Shattered Glass. Gaia, or Gaia, defeats Primus and becomes the metal world that is now, I guess, Cybertron, for lack of a better term. It should be noted that, we don't really have sparks in Shattered Glass. We have embers, which function the same as sparks, but they're not called sparks. They're red, and they're called embers. The Dinobots become the Dino Cons, if I'm not mistaken. A lot of the original story takes place in Polyhex, so I expect Polyhex to be pretty much in the forefront here as a location. Megatron is a mathematician who led an uprising. He still became Galvatron, really thanks to, I think, Primus, if I'm not mistaken, via Nexus Prime. If I'm not mistaken, I think it was Nexus Prime who is the catalyst for turning Megatron into Galvatron in the Shattered Glass universe. And the whole concept of transforming, the ability to transform, was something that was started by Megatron. It was a way for Decepticons to hide. of course, the Autobots learn that same art as well. So these are tenets that I'm looking for as we go forward. Keep those things in mind as we kick off with Chapter 1. And Chapter 1 is Blur's comic. And so Blur's comic is what kicks off this story. It was written by Danny Lohr. It seems like the editing was done by Riley Farmer and David Marriott. The art herein is by renowned artist Guido Guidi. We'll see kind of, like I said, how it goes. It begins with Blur talking about the rainy season. I'm not sure what exactly rains there, because the images that we see are of him kind of avoiding. It doesn't look like rain. It certainly looks like fallout, asphalt. He talks about bounties. He says things that I suppose are meant to set up what's to come later, but it seems very disjointed. Like, he talks about Gold City without explaining what that is, other than saying that it's a place that's built on paranoia by traders. But okay, why is it named Gold City? I wish that there was a little bit more there. I'll also say this, I'm going to throw it out there now. A lot of the sections that are in boxes, not speech, but he's thinking to himself, or he's the narrator, is done with these italic letters that I don't find nice to read at all. He says that he is trying, he goes and he visits Ratchet, and he basically says that Ratchet is trying and failing to make make the unbeatable, whatever the unbeatable is. But that wouldn't have died in battle next to him, causing him all sorts of trauma. Something like that. Like, the words make no sense. That's a direct quote. Trying and failing to make the unbeatable, but that wouldn't have died in battle next to him, causing him all sorts of trauma. Something like that. Right away, you've given me bits and pieces of an introduction of a story and locations without context, and now you have a line here that it just seems like rambling. So it's a bit of a hard start. As a matter of fact, I've also found it, after this quote, even more difficult to read, because Blur starts to speak very quickly and there's no spaces between the words. So your brain needs to stop and decipher what each word is. He doesn't do that all the time, but it seems like when Blur gets excitable, he goes to that mannerism where he speaks quickly. That being said, right now, the setup has sort of been a little bit confusing enough that I don't think that helped to kind of keep things clean. We find out that Six-Shot has apparently been deactivated. And there's talk of like Blur being an adrenaline junkie. I think it's actually Ratchet who says that to Blur. And at first I didn't know that it was Ratchet speaking. When Blur speaks, there's like a blue line around the text box. When Ratchet speaks, there's like a red line around it. It's a very subtle difference, and I didn't notice it at first, so I wasn't sure who was speaking for a little while. We find out that there's a bounty by Goldbug, a very special bounty on someone that he wants alive, and that someone is going to be Starscream. We see Shattered Glass, Chrome Dome, and Hardhead. Blur is being very kind of, arrogant, kind of cocky, and kind of says, hey, I'll be able to get that. I'm the best bounty hunter going. Starscream is still vain, which is interesting because the original Shattered Glass Starscream, more than vain, I found him to be more, I don't know, almost like a creepy level of praise for Megatron more than praise for himself. So it seems like a little bit of a stylized take on his personality, but I sort of dig it. I sort of like it because it's still familiar. We have a nice full page of Blur and Starscream back to back. Starscream is basically trying to avoid, like I said earlier, Chrome Dome and Hardhead, and Blur seemingly helps Starscream, which seemed a little odd and certainly puts Starscream on his guard. Blur plans to convince Starscream, rather than capture him, he plans to convince Starscream to go and meet Goldbug on his own. Therefore, he'd get the bounty by delivering Starscream alive, and then Goldbug can do what he likes. There's talk of the static zone. I'm not sure what that is. Blur says he wants stuff to make sense. Says he is neutral. says he's not an Autobot. Starscream isn't buying it. The war seems to be done, but I'm not 100% sure on that. I think it's done, and I think this is like post-war. And the scouts from the war, they now needed purpose, so a lot of those scouts became bounty hunters. And if Goldbug wants someone, then other Autobots will come, right? So Blur is like, look, I'm a bounty hunter, but I'm not really on any sides. Look, here's the thing. Goldbug wants you. Just go and meet the guy. See what he has to say. And look, if he wants you, then you don't have to worry so much about me, but other Autobots are going to come. Starscream's not buying it. He's like, Blur, come on. You're a bounty hunter and you just want to take me in. They have a fight. Starscream still, like I said, loves himself and talks highly of himself. And he says to Blur, like, oh, I get what you're trying to do. You're trying to be my pal and tug on my spark. Tug on my spark. So, like, his heartstrings. He shouldn't say tug on his spark. They don't have sparks. They have embers, so that's inaccurate. Starscream and Blur end up, like I said, in battle. Starscream outthinks Blur rather than beating Blur. And basically there's lava that kind of covers Blur and hardens as a volcano erupts. And that's kind of where we end, basically. It's really weird. Blur didn't have a big role. I found the writing somewhat disjointed. I did like the personality of Starscream. The art was all right. Very much reminded me of like 1990s Marvel Comics Spider-Man run, Todd McFarlane, with a lot of additional detail, and there's sort of a gritty take on it. I sort of liked the personality of Ratchet as well. I didn't like some of the disjointed stuff. Certain elements were introduced here without explanation, and I found that jarring. And if I wasn't paying attention to the outline color on certain text boxes, there were moments when I would lose track of who was talking. I feel like the writing was okay. I feel like the art was okay. I feel like the editing sort of fell a little bit flat. Nevertheless, by the end of this chapter, Blur is kind of taken out. Starscream's aware that there's a bounty on his head. That's the takeaway. I just feel like the path that we traveled to get to that takeaway was a little more convoluted and complex than it really needed to be. And so we go to Chapter 2. This is Megatron's chapter. The only real difference here in terms of people working on it that's worth noting is that the art this time is done by Daniel Kana, and I think I prefer it better. It seems more blocky, but it also seems more true to, say, G1 animation to me. It is a little more simplistic. It doesn't seem as gritty as Guido's, but it still fills the bill, and I find it more personally aesthetically pleasing. Naturally, that is a subjective stance. Right in the very beginning, we are introduced to Prowl, who has quite the color scheme, and we find out that he runs an area. We find out that Goldbug and Gold City seem to be somewhat linked. And then there's another area, from what I can tell, that's run by Optimus Prime, Orion Pax, not 100% sure. However, there is a little recap right at the very beginning. I like that. It was very much like a last time on Shattered Glass, and I did appreciate that. We begin this chapter, if you will, with Megatron in the desert. He's wearing a cloak. It's very Dark of the Moon Megatronish to me. He talks about how he's been in solitude, and all that time there hasn't been a seeker overhead. He's been alone for cycles, he says. How did Starscream get Megatron's coordinates? That I didn't understand. Starscream finds Megatron. I don't know how he knows where Megatron is. And speaking of which, like, how did Blur get him one step closer to Megatron? Because Starscream says, well, Blur got me one step closer to Megatron. I don't know how. I don't have a clue how that was connected. I'm not even sure how Blur found Starscream. Like, there's definite gaps there and parts of the story that, as best as I can understand, are glossed over or altogether left out. Starscream finds Megatron, and then he passes out. Megatron, still cloaked, calls him a fool. Starscream's explanation makes little sense to me. They talk of the history of Starscream joining Megatron's cause and how Starscream is a scholar more than like a combatant. We see, I'll say, a time jump to protests that happen outside the Senate, and we have Megatron arguing with Prowl. Megs has like friends in the Senate, so like though he gets in trouble with the law very often, his buddy Orion gets him off because they do have a history, even though that is strained. It is noted that Megatron is a miner and that he's tired of the mining class being treated like trash, and that leads to an uprising. This is a huge departure from Megatron's characterization. He isn't a miner in Shattered Glass, he is a mathematician. So I get the motivation, but I'm not a huge fan of that. He gets arrested. Ratbat becomes a senator, but that didn't really do anything to help them because he's kind of a backbencher. Starscream needs a leader because he has a Titan-sized target on his back, and Megatron says, "I'm not your leader anymore. The Decepticons aren't really a thing." Then we go back in time again, and Orion gets Megatron out of prison again, and like he erased like this disorderly conduct charge from his record. Then Orion like belittles the whole cause and says, "Megatron, like, come on, you gotta give this up, right?" Megatron points out how Impurata, which is like mental torturing, was used against Shockwave, and that his head and hands were replaced. Like it sounds pretty bad, to be honest with you. Then Orion and Megatron, they have a little scuffle in a fight. Megatron says that his leadership only cost the Decepticons, right? It didn't help them. And we go back now to like the present, where he's with Starscream. Megatron says that he's speaking from his spark. Again, he should be speaking from his ember. So far the characterization of Megatron's not right. Again, he's referring to sparks. Autobots won the war on Earth. Megatron was, broken. Eventually, he found his way back to Cybertron and discovered that Optimus Prime, Prowl, and Goldbug had infighting, and they were basically three warlords that controlled three areas. Starscream recalls things differently, and he says that Megatron was a dashing leader, and he had dashing troops. Megatron saved Thundercracker from Bumblebee, and again we see that Megatron like used his fusion cannon. He took out Bumblebee, and that's why Bumblebee got rebuilt as Goldbug, because there happened to be spare parts around. Megatron sent everyone else away to protect them while he fought Optimus Prime. He didn't want anybody else getting hurt. It's very convoluted. Like, by the end of it, I feel like we've been jumping between two time periods. One where the Decepticons were still a thing and having protests outside the Senate, to now post-war. So there's a whole part of the war story that doesn't seem to be told here. And I think by the end of this chapter, there's some rumblings about how Starscream's spark is able to do something with Titans, but it's not clearly explained. I didn't like the abrupt time jumps without explanation. I found the time jumps somewhat jarring. We went from linear storytelling in Chapter 1 to non-linear storytelling in Chapter 2. And if you were paying enough attention, it was okay. But to say that it felt like a smooth read would simply not be true. And the entire reason it doesn't feel like a smooth read is not because the writing is bad or anything like that. It's because we have such abrupt time jumps that I think should have been handled better in editing, that it causes the story to seem somewhat jarring and disjointed. That being said, I did like to see development of Megatron and his motivation, even if that motivation is not true to what us Shattered Glass fans know as his original motivation. The whole discussion of sparks instead of embers, that's kind of bugging me a little bit. I hope that doesn't continue as we go forward. Chapter 2, mediocre success in my books. But I do think that the art was exponentially better. I like this style better. And now we come to Chapter 3, Starscream. And I would say that this is a pivotal part of this story. It's also the sloppiest part of this story, unfortunately. I didn't enjoy this at all. The editing is atrocious. It's some of the worst editing of any story, of any company, of any comic that I've ever read. And I'm going to explain it as best I can, as best as I can decipher this going through. So we do start off with our roll call and our recap as we always do. The lettering is still better. I forgot to mention that in issue 1, it was done by, I think, like Letter Squid, and it changed to Neil in issue 2, and now 3, I think, going forward. And I do like his lettering style a little bit better. Megatron goes with Starscream, and they seem to seek out Soundwave, but they come in contact with Laserbeak and Ravage first. Ravage talks very, very clearly, which is kind of a cool nod to the fact that he was able to do that in Japan. Apparently he could do it in G1 too, but we just never heard it. Soundwave seeks out cons so that they aren't alone, because some of them have suffered such traumas. He was the morale officer during the war. So now we kind of get a confirmation that, okay, so this is post-war. He reaches out to some to help, but others are just too traumatized. So he says, like, okay, so Megatron, Starscream, like, I'm going to be able to get some help, some backup, but it's not going to be everyone, because some of them just, they can't do battle anymore. So he had contacted the Seekers. Soundwave talks about a light show near Metroplex, but I don't know what light show he's talking about. There's again something that's being referenced that's not being explained, and it took me out of I guess the story, because now I'm wondering, well, what are you talking about, light show? Now we do then jump to a scene of Starscream and Jetfire while Megatron grabs Prowl. It's a jarring time jump, but it's obviously a time jump. Jetfire and Starscream look to Orion Pax for funding to test whether or not a Titan is, namely Metroplex, is just inert. Maybe we can reactivate him, we can wake him up. Maybe we can learn a lot about the history of Cybertron from this dozing Titan and whatnot. It takes a lot of research, takes a lot of funding, a lot of work. So they go to Orion Pax to try and help with that funding. Pax says the issue is looking for academic funding. Focus on power, right? And that conversation is a little jarring, but the idea, I think, and the innuendo that's made is that, look, if you're looking for funding because you want to be able to wake a Titan to apply some sort of military purpose, cool. If you're looking for it just for academics to learn about the history of the planet, nobody cares about that. That's kind of my takeaway from a bit of a weird conversation. Then it seems to jut back to what I'm calling the present. And there's talk of, recruiting more members, and then the cassette transforms. I think it's eject is there. So like when we come back to the present, we have Starscream and Megatron no longer with Soundwave. Now they're kind of like in a bar, I guess, and they get approached by Blaster and the cassettes, namely eject. And then it seems to jut again to Starscream and Jetfire. And this time they're at Metroplex, who's colored like Metro Titan, which is kind of neat. And Starscream is excited to break the communication barrier with Titans. This is going to be great. We can learn so much. Orion doesn't want to learn about Cybertronian history from Titans. He wants to control them, which that does match kind of his personality. Now, there are times with some of these jumps where it seems like he's referred to as Orion Pax. There are times with some of these jumps where he seems to be referred to as Optimus Prime, but there's no explanation as to how or why his name changes. His look doesn't. Even as Orion Pax, he looks like Optimus Prime. Then we, let's see. Then it juts back to what I'm calling the present again, where Blaster and his minions, like, basically want to, double down on a bounty here because Goldbug still wants Starscream, and now we can bring in Megatron as well. So, then basically there's a scuffle. The cassette bots basically get dismantled. Megatron holds Blaster and tells him, and tells Starscream to run. So again, Megatron is willing to hold Blaster and whatever's left of the cassettes off, while Starscream runs away. Starscream does run again, but regrets it later on. Then it seems to jut across time again to Jetfire talking to Orion Pax, even though when they went looking for funding, Starscream had gotten angry and walked out because he was like, no, this is about history and science. This isn't about, your military aspirations. We don't need your money, Orion Pax. Well, Jetfire feels like we do need that funding because funding will run out if we don't get it. So behind Starscream's back, he goes back and tries to kind of strike a deal with Orion Pax. Starscream had followed him to, I'm going to say, the Senate, and is kind of outside the office and listening, so he kind of knows that Jetfire has done this now behind his back. Then, for some reason, it says a few cycles ago, which I find confusing because we had been going between 2 time jump periods. One with Starscream and Jetfire dealing with trying to get the Titans awake, and then what seems to be in the present with Starscream and Megatron, kind of seeking support from other Decepticons via Soundwave and encountering Blaster. And then a few cycles ago, this almost feels like it's a third time area. I have no clue what Starscream is trying to do at this point. Or why Jetfire and other Autobots are chasing him. It's a lot of action, but I don't understand how it fits in with the story at all. I don't know if it's Starscream doing something when he got mad at Jetfire for looking for funding from Orion Pax, and then he was going to make his way to the Titan to do something, or if this is Starscream after escaping, Blaster's clutches, and now going to the Titan and being pursued in the present by Jetfire and I guess some Autobots. I don't know where this fits in, to be perfectly honest with you. Nevertheless, Starscream, from whatever time area, is headed toward a Titan and he's being pursued by Jetfire. We learned that only Starscream's spark is strong enough to run the code that's necessary to talk to Titans. Starscream communes with Metroplex. Jetfire and Goldbug arrive. I don't know how they knew where Starscream was going. I guess Jetfire would know where the Titan was, and I guess the assumption was made that Starscream was going to go where Metroplex is buried. But it's not explicitly said, so I'm not 100% sure how they knew where he was. And with him showing up with Goldbug, why is he in cahoots with Goldbug? Is Jetfire a bounty hunter? Because he kind of says, I'm not doing this for money, so why are you doing this? Why are you selling out your buddy to Goldbug? I could even see if Goldbug was loyal to Orion Pax, but Goldbug isn't loyal to Orion Pax. He's one of the 3 warlords, so he's like his own boss. It seems like there might be 3 time periods here, but I'm not sure. It is so poorly, sloppy edited with so many holes that while it gives a ton of important information, it's very hard to follow. And it's hard to know where Jetfire's loyalties are, why his loyalties are suddenly with Goldbug. It's just, it wasn't well done. Chapter 2 introduced non-linear storytelling. This is way left field non-linear, and I found that what I had to do in order to make sense of it was abandon trying to follow the timeline and just pick the bits and pieces that seemingly fit into my headcanon of what's going on here. I'm reading a story done by a professional comic book company. I shouldn't have to fill in gaps and use my own headcanon here. I should be able to read your story, knowing the previous Shattered Glass canon as I do, and this should fit in with that. Or, if it is a new Shattered Glass universe, that should have been very clearly established early on that this is not the Shattered Glass that you know and love. This is a completely different universe. I think that would be a lazy way of doing things. Shattered Glass has a lot of its own lore and a lot of its own established pieces of fiction and points, and most of those pieces of fiction have all tied together. I feel like that this was lazy editing, and while the writing is okay, why didn't the author of this story actually go and do some Shattered Glass research? Because you obviously didn't. So I look at it as poor editing and kind of lazy writing when you didn't do your background research. Things are going rough as we head into Chapter 4. And Chapter 4 is Goldbug, and it really focuses on him as the true antagonist of this story, which I didn't expect. I mean, I've been waiting for Optimus Prime to rear his head as the big baddie, but it seems like thus far Goldbug is going to be. Again, we have Daniel Kana come back and do the artwork this time. Guido did Chapter 3, and we still have the recap and roll call, which is fine. Megs destroyed Goldbug's old body, and now Goldbug was rebuilt, of course, or Bumblebee was rebuilt as Goldbug on Earth. And, Optimus Prime had seen Goldbug or Bumblebee being beaten as a failure, right? He didn't want to rebuild Bumblebee into Goldbug. It's just that they had the extra parts, and Ratchet even says, well, at least we didn't waste resources, and Optimus kind of says, didn't we though? Because he was fine with Bumblebee being gone. Bumblebee was always trying to prove himself to Optimus. He didn't want to be a joke. He didn't want to be a laughingstock. He didn't want to be weak. He wanted to be strong. He wanted to be powerful. That's his motivation for everything he's doing. To never be a joke again. To never be weak again. So we find out that basically he's very insecure. And now he's trying to see himself as powerful. Starscream is caught by Jetfire and Goldbug. And this will show Optimus Prime his worth. This will show just what I bring to the table. Skywarp teleports in. He's mostly blue. He's going to mount a rescue for Starscream. I don't know how Skywarp knew where Starscream had been taken by Jetfire and Goldbug. I'm not sure how he knew where in all of Gold City they were, but he does, and he goes in there. This doesn't last long, though. By the way, if I didn't already say, Gold City is named for Goldbug, because he kind of rules it with an iron fist. Nevertheless, Goldbug finds out that Skywarp is there. He goes, they have a little scuffle, and Goldbug basically rips his head off. And he says to himself, you'll have to do better than that, Megatron, because here's the thing, Goldbug, he doesn't fight the underlings. He wants the big boss because Goldbug is strong. Then on the next page, just the next page, so he had just taken off Skywarp's head and said, this'll, you're going to have to do better than that, Megatron. On the next page, without any explanation, all of a sudden we have Goldbug talking to Optimus Prime, saying that Prowl is acting suspicious, and Optimus, basically doesn't listen and, calls him Bumblebee and kind of says, go away, Bumblebee, I don't need you around me. By this point, he'd been renamed as Goldbug, so calling him Bumblebee was meant to be an insult. Prowl is standing in the shadows and says, see, I told you Optimus Prime wouldn't listen. Do you want to know how we're going to take Cybertron? Right, how we're going to rule Cybertron. And then it seems like we jump again to I'm going to call it the present, where Jetfire and Goldbug are, along with, suddenly, for some reason, Slicer, or Wheeljack, if you will. Shattered Glass Wheeljack, better known as Slicer. And, there's this nonsensical exchange that gets interrupted by an impatient Goldbug. Slicer and Jetfire are having a discussion about trying to get some information from Starscream. Goldbug comes in, because remember, he had been battling Skywarp and taking his head off. And he comes in and he says, this is taking too long. And interrupts them. He takes the head of Skywarp and he kind of throws it down on the ground in front of Starscream and says, you might as well cooperate with us. You might as well give up whatever it is he knows or has or can do. I think it's the code to talk to Titans is what they want. He says, this is what Megatron sent. He couldn't be bothered to come and save you himself. He's not going to save you. He's not going to help you. Nobody cares about you, Starscream, right? That's where he's kind of too. In essence, Goldbug is really Breaking Bad, right? This is the worst that Goldbug could get. It's not clear if Starscream just has the code or if they want his spark to talk to the body of a Titan or what. Starscream makes fun of Goldbug. He starts laughing because he realizes what Goldbug wants most is validation. Validation that he's strong. He wants to elicit fear
from Starscream because he's strong. And Starscream, laughing at him, is throwing Goldbug right off of his his mindset, throwing Goldbug right off of his calculated moves to try and get the information he wants from Starscream. He's looking to have Goldbug make a mistake. So Starscream makes fun of him. Jetfire says, if you fry him, Goldbug, like, we get nothing. We don't get the information that you've been looking for and that you wanted if we basically do damage to him, right? Then the Insecticons, they kind of arrive as like the cavalry. And again, we're kind of now side by side having two timelines because Goldbug finds out that the Insecticons are there, and going down on like the left side of the page, we have Goldbug fighting Optimus Prime, and he's called Optimus Prime at this point. Why they're fighting, I don't know. It's not explained. At the same time, on the other side of the page, Goldbug is fighting the Insecticons, and he is besting the Insecticons, to be fair. After the battle is done, Goldbug berates Jetfire's ineptitude at getting the information out of Starscream, and he takes out his bazooka and he aims it at a chained Starscream, and that is where we end. Starscream at point blank range. This one was a little more linear. The motivation for Goldbug is laid out fairly clearly. Good character development for him, and a good explanation for why he is a main antagonist here. I didn't like the jarring jumps between his relationship with Optimus Prime and his kind of present position. But I accept it because the jumps were setting up why Goldbug was as embittered as he is, why Goldbug is as vicious as he is. What I'm left unclear about is he trying to get this information for his own machinations and motives, or does he want this information from Starscream to prove something to Optimus Prime? That's not made real clear. That being said, after the gobbledygook mess that was Chapter 3, I felt like Chapter 4 was cleaner, more succinct, and while there was a time jump and it was a bit jarring, it didn't take me out of the story. It instead served to build as the background for why Goldbug is the way he is. And finally, Chapter 5 is Jetfire's chapter, and this is the most simplistic of all of them. In the past, we see Jetfire getting beaten, presumably by Starscream. I think it's like a silhouetted outline of what looks to be a Seeker. I assume it's Starscream. We don't really see it. By the way, I mentioned earlier how Soundwave had contacted the Seekers for Starscream, but in Shattered Glass, the Seekers are Autobots. Like, by my recollection, the Decepticons didn't really have Seekers per se, so there's another kind of oversight, if you will, even though I'm using the term Seeker a little loosely myself, to be fair. And it looks like that Jetfire thinks, like, you should have let me die then and there. He says that the cons always lose. They lack strength to hold power, and that's probably true. In the present, he tries to reason with Goldbug, saying, if you get rid of Starscream, then we're not going to get anything. All of this was for nothing, right? He says to Autobots, he is an informer. To Starscream, a traitor, and Goldbug wants him to be an executioner, right? So Jetfire's torn in a lot of directions, right? To the Autobots, he's an informer, right? An informant. To Starscream, a traitor, and to Goldbug, well, Goldbug wants him to be an executioner, right? Like, no, we're done with Starscream. Time for him to go. Jetfire punches Goldbug and ends up helping Starscream. Goldbug shoots Starscream in the back. Goldbug reaches through. Now, I did think that this was kind of cool. At this point, Goldbug reaches through the wound in Starscream's back and grabs his spark chamber. Outside, the fighting stops when Starscream yells in agony. I assume it was Starscream who yells in agony. And for some reason, like, the Autobots and the Decepticons are all outside in Gold City, fighting each other. Why? I don't know. I don't know why that battle came about, per se. I don't really know what it was supposed to be accomplishing. I don't know if it was the Decepticons with Megatron coming to try and rescue Starscream. I don't know. There's a battle going on. They hear Starscream and the battle stops. But I don't know why the battle was going on in the first place. Jetfire loses it. And he takes Starscream's body and he flies off, followed by Megatron. Jetfire blames everyone and says that Starscream was a scholar, not a soldier. Megatron says that he will erect a memorial to Starscream. It's weird because at first Megatron goes after Jetfire to, I guess, rescue Starscream. Then he realizes, no, Starscream's dead, and then he's like, oh, well, we'll do a memorial. It's just, there's a lot of emotions that change really quickly there. Then there's a report that Slicer is giving to Ultra Magnus of all people. And he says that Gold City will fall. Goldbug has Starscream's spark. Prowl and Optimus Prime, they're going to want it. So the three of them are probably going to continue with their infighting. He who controls the spark controls the Titan. And he who controls a Titan controls Cybertron. So right now it looks like the ball is in Goldbug's court. And then in the very last panel, it seems like Goldbug is using the spark to awaken Metroplex, who seems to be yelling, I don't know. And then we have the end with a question mark. So this story ends on a cliffhanger when we knew there wasn't going to be any more story. Like, how is that good storytelling? How is that good editing? How is that good writing? You gave me, I'll say, the beginning of this story, but the end is pretty darn lackluster, if you ask me. The writing here was cut off before we had an end to the story and a true climax. The editing has always been a little iffy. The art is the strongest point of Part 5, in my humble opinion. So what do I think of the Shattered Glass series overall? I've always said that IDW is not great. Their writing is very jarring and disjointed with a lot of things left out. The editing has never been a strong point. And the art, depending on who's doing it, is either good or mediocre. This didn't change my mind. It's some neat ideas put in this story. It totally spits in the face of true Shattered Glass fans that already know the lore. It shows that you didn't do research when you were tasked with writing the story to know what you're writing about. You don't know your subject material. And then the editing gives us a beginning and a middle, but no real end. To me, that's a failure in storytelling.
And here we are once again. So there's good, bad, and ugly here. I'm going to start with the ugly and work my way back to the good so that we end on a high note. When it comes to the ugly, now I have to be fair before I get into this and say I've never been a fan of the IDW treatment of Transformers. I've never been a fan of Transformers in comics. I had some of the, Marvel G1 stuff, and I was like, it's okay. It's all right. But it never was my go-to fiction personally. I always thought that these big bots served, lived, existed better in full motion and full animation as a cartoon or a film or whatever. But I know that there has been a cult fan following of IDW for many, many years, and while I tried to jump on many times, it just never landed with me for a number of reasons. So let's start with the ugly of this first. The ugliest part is that this pretty much spits in the face of anybody who is a true Shattered Glass fan. This is lazy writing, not bad writing. There's a difference, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but this is lazy writing. It is obvious that the author did not go back and learn about the tenets of Shattered Glass so that he could use things correctly. For example, the entire history of Megatron, incorrect. He's not even the right job in Shattered Glass. Optimus Prime, if you will, is supposed to be maniacal. He is not here. He is conniving. He feels more like Sentinel Prime than he does Shattered Glass, the vicious Shattered Glass Optimus Prime. They talk about sparks instead of embers. The term Seeker is applied to the jets that are like Starscream. In Shattered Glass, Seekers are Autobot cars, not what we know as regular Seekers. They took too many of the things that we know and love about regular Transformers, and instead of adhering to the previously established elements of Shattered Glass, all they did is give a repaint to what we already know and call that good enough. More background research into what Transformers Shattered Glass was should have been done by the author. Perhaps he wasn't able to. Perhaps he didn't have the time. Perhaps it's not his fault and it was the demands put on him by Hasbro. In which case, and I've said this before, Hasbro needs to keep their fingers out of fiction because they do it poorly. As well, when it comes to something that is ugly, the editing here is atrocious. We have really a story that starts out being told in the linear timeline that becomes non-linear in issue 2, becomes exceedingly non-linear to the point of being gobbledygook in issue 3, to becoming soft non-linear in issue 4 and 5. And I say soft non-linear because in issue 4 with Goldbug, we're able to see his history with Optimus Prime and what's going on now. And it's pretty clear that the history that's being shown is being handpicked to establish the history and characterization of Goldbug. I feel like if he was going to be the main antagonist, we should have had that history of that character established long before issue 4. But I digress. At least it got established, and it was some character development for Goldbug. We'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Issue 5 was the most simplistic and straightforward. It's just too bad that the story didn't have an end. When you leave it on a cliffhanger like that where a Titan is just waking up, even though you've made the statement that whoever controls the Titans controls Cybertron, the guess would be that I guess Goldbug controls Cybertron because he controls Metroplex? We're not even sure if he controls Metroplex. There's a lot of open-ended questions here, and I've never been a fan of any story in any franchise at any time that the end is left with the end question mark. It's never been a mode of storytelling I've enjoyed or liked. I want an end. I want a beginning, a middle, and an end, and they failed to give that to us here. As well, with the editing, there's a lot of gaps and holes here. There was obviously a war that went on, and we're seeing bits and pieces from before that seem to be out of order, and now we're seeing the aftermath. I'm not even clear when Orion Pax became Optimus Prime or how, because it's not explained. Did he ever live to go on? Because I don't think we ever actually see Optimus in the present. So did Optimus live? Did he go on to become Nova Prime as he's supposed to? What about Megatron? We see him in the present. So has he not reached far enough along in the timeline yet to become Galvatron, as Shattered Glass Megatron still does? Should have done during the war. This doesn't make sense. And if it's a reboot, then that's just a lazy way of saying we didn't do our homework, so we're going to call it a new universe, even though this new universe is only lasting for 5 issues. Big gaps and holes, not adhering to all of the ideas previously established for Shattered Glass, and leaving out significant parts of the story and events that happen, creating huge holes, as well as ineffective non-linear storytelling, all made this fall quite flat. But that doesn't mean everything is bad. There's also the good. There were great aspects here of character development that we saw for Goldbug especially. We saw the moral dilemma that Jetfire was going through. We saw the background relationship of Orion Pax and Megatron and how dismissive Orion Pax got. And how he was more conniving, though I prefer my Shattered Glass Optimus Primes to be more maniacal than conniving, but that's just me. We saw, the guilt that Megatron has. So there were some great character elements throughout. It would have been nice to see them fleshed out more, but this was a limited series and it is what it is. I'm disappointed, though, that in some of those elements they don't stay true to the original characterization of those characters. Most notably, I was really disappointed that Megatron isn't this peaceful mathematician who is like a university professor. He's still just a miner. And while that does give him a good motivation for rising up, it's not true to the character of Shattered Glass Megatron. Then we get to the good. And the good is that there were great tent poles that they wanted to hit on as they told this story. And I've often talked about tent poles or wire poles, even with my own writing. As an author, whenever you write something, you should know, before you ever write a word, you should know how your story is going to go. You should know what you want your end to be, what you want your middle to be, and how you're going to begin it. You may have 3 or 4 or 5 major events that you want to have occur in this story. Now, your job as an author, and where you can get creative and interesting, is how do I run a wire from this pole to the next pole to get from my opening event to my first major event, from that major event to the next major event, from that major event to the next, and finally to the end. The devil is in the details, and the details exist on those wires. While I think the poles of events here were good and interesting, and you had a story map, the way that you weave together the wires between each of those major events was very lackluster, very poorly done. And there were times when there were conversations that were nonsensical, and there were times that there were conversations that the actual wording just made no sense. So I give credit to the wire poles, to those big events. You had a map. I just wish you had followed it better. And also for the good, I think the artwork was just fine. I personally prefer Canna over Guido Guidi, but that's a subjective thing. I've never been impressed by this company's treatment of Transformers. I was willing to give this an opportunity, a chance, a shot, based on my knowledge of Shattered Glass, based on my knowledge of writing, based on my knowledge as a teacher of how you analyze writing. This doesn't live up to that. If I was to assign this a grade out of 10, as I always do, I would say that this is, at best, about a 5, maybe a 6. If you have been in on the Shattered Glass line, you have those characters, it might be worth the read. But don't expect this to ever become some masterpiece of fiction, because it's just not there. Let me know what you thought about the Shattered Glass Comics 4, this recent set from Pulse. I appreciate you guys coming by, giving me some of your extremely valuable time. I do know how important it is to you. If you're in a position to help the channel to grow, you can use the donate link. You can check us out on Patreon. You can see what we offer to you through Teespring, or of course you can hit the join button right here on YouTube and become a channel member. Also hit the subscribe button. Don't forget that somehow, some way, each and every day you do make a difference. I'm just sorry I didn't have better news for you today. And I look forward, baby, to the next time that you and I get together to have another visit, either in the live streams on Thursday nights at the stop motion premieres or the old-fashioned way, right here inside the videos.